On a routine flight, Jamal Richardson, a successful black CEO, faced an incident that would change everything. What started as a simple mistake with a flight attendant quickly escalated into something far bigger than he could have imagined. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more eye-opening stories just like this. An accidental coffee spill turns into an unexpected confrontation. But when Jamal stands up for himself, the response he receives leaves everyone in shock. The plane hummed steadily as it cruised at 30,000 feet. The clouds below casting a soft, serene glow through the windows. Inside the cabin, passengers were either sleeping or absorbed in their personal screens. But for Jamal Richardson, the atmosphere was anything but relaxing. As the CEO of one of the country's largest tech companies, he had a lot on his plate. He needed to be alert, making calls and planning his next big move. The flight to New York was his opportunity to unwind for just a few hours, catch up on some work and perhaps enjoy a bit of peace before landing into the whirlwind of meetings and deals awaiting him. Jamal was a black man, tall and athletic, with an air of confidence that came from years of hard work. He had earned his success, but it wasn't without struggle. His company had faced countless challenges, some from competitors, others from people who couldn't accept the fact that a man like him had made it to the top. But he'd never let that stop him. Today was no different, and he wasn't about to let anything ruin his focus. As he glanced at the window, a flight attendant approached. Clara, a young woman in her mid-20s, with pale skin and blonde hair, moved down the aisle with a coffee cart. She was smiling at the passengers, offering beverages with a polite but distant demeanor. Jamal's eyes followed her for a moment before he returned to his laptop, making notes for an upcoming pitch. Clara was nearing his row when she suddenly stopped in front of him, her smile still fixed in place. "Would you like some coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice flat, lacking the enthusiasm typically expected from an airline attendant. Jamal glanced up, feeling a slight unease in the air. There was something in the way she looked at him, as though she didn't quite expect him to respond. Despite his irritation, Jamal nodded. "Yes, I'll take black coffee, please." He immediately jumped up from his seat, trying to stop the burn. "Ah," he gasped, quickly grabbing a napkin from the tray. Clara's eyes widened in surprise, but instead of an apology, she stood there silently. The words Jamal was expecting never came. "No, I'm so sorry," or "let me help you." Just awkward silence. It was as though she had no empathy at all. Jamal, struggling with the burn on his skin, looked up at her, his heart racing. He wiped his lap, but the damage had already been done. He glared at Clara, his voice cold but controlled. "You could have been more careful. Do you know how hot that coffee was?" Clara's lips parted, but she didn't seem concerned. Instead, she muttered an apology, but it wasn't convincing. "I didn't mean..." She turned away quickly, walking off toward another passenger, as if trying to escape the confrontation. Jamal sat back down, but the heat from the coffee lingered on his legs, both physically and emotionally. The sting wasn't just from the burn, it was from the dismissive attitude he'd just witnessed. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, more suffocating. Jamal stared at the back of Clara as she moved down the aisle, the faint sounds of the other passengers drowning out his thoughts. The hurt from the spill had faded, but the discomfort of the situation remained. Jamal wasn't one to make a scene, but this wasn't just a clumsy accident. He had been on flights hundreds of times, and never had he encountered an attitude like that. Something about the way she treated him, the lack of care. It felt intentional. He tried to push the thought aside, but it gnawed at him, digging deeper into his mind. Was it because of the way he looked? Because he was black? Jamal had dealt with subtle racism before, but this felt more blatant, a direct insult that went beyond a careless mistake. His fingers hovered over his phone, ready to make a call, but instead he paused. No, he couldn't let this go unchecked. As the plane continued its journey, Jamal's mind raced. He couldn't simply ignore what had happened. He had worked his whole life to get to where he was, to be taken seriously, to be respected. And here, in this moment, a flight attendant had undermined all of that with a careless, racially charged act. He stood up and walked to the back of the plane, his eyes scanning for Clara. As he approached the galley, he found her talking to a fellow attendant, whispering and laughing. They didn't notice him right away. "Excuse me," Jamal said, his voice firm but controlled. Clara and the other attendant turned to face him. Clara's smile faltered slightly when she saw his expression, but she didn't say anything at first. "You spilled coffee on me," Jamal said coldly, And your attitude made it worse. I'm not going to stand by and let this slide. Clara looked taken aback. I'm sorry, she muttered, though the apology felt hollow. I didn't mean it. You didn't mean it. But you still did, and it's not just the coffee, Jamal said, his eyes narrowing. It's the way you treated me, the dismissiveness. It's obvious you don't respect me. Clara's face turned red, and for a moment Jamal could see the realization of what he had said sinking. But before she could respond, another flight attendant appeared, and the conversation shifted. I'll speak with the captain, Jamal said, his voice not rising but holding an undeniable weight. This won't be the last of this. You're going to hear from me. As he walked back to his seat, his emotions churned. He was upset, but more than that, he felt betrayed. He knew that he would not let this go without action. The reaction from Clara had confirmed something he had long feared, but never fully confronted. Racial prejudice, no matter how subtle, was deeply embedded in everyday life. Jamal sat back in his seat, the intensity of the situation still weighing on him. His phone was in his hands, his fingers tapping nervously as his thoughts raced. He was a CEO, a businessman who had built his empire on calculated decisions and hard work. But this felt like something deeper, something he couldn't let slide without taking action. As the plane descended, the turbulence jolted the passengers awake from their temporary slumber. Jamal's mind was no longer focused on the flight, but on the injustice he had just faced. The coffee spill, the lack of accountability from the flight attendants, it all came together in a way he hadn't expected. The subtle racism that had reared its ugly head on this flight was just a reminder of something much larger, the systemic issues that black people face every day. Once the plane had landed and the seatbelt sign blinked off, Jamal stood up, trying to steady himself as the passengers began to deboard. The cabin was filled with chatter, the rush of people eager to get off the plane, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. He was determined to address the incident head-on. He walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, making his way to the galley where Clara and her colleagues were preparing to deboard. As he approached, he could see Clara's nervous expression. The other flight attendants had noticed Jamal walking toward them, and a few of them stepped back, giving him space. Clara glanced at him, then quickly looked away, a wave of guilt flashing across her face. She couldn't hide the tension in her body. She knew exactly why he was coming for her. Jamal took a deep breath before speaking, his voice controlled, but carrying an undeniable force. I need to speak with the captain, he said, locking eyes with Clara. I'll get him for you, Clara said, her voice cracking slightly as she turned to walk toward the cockpit. It didn't take long for the captain to arrive. He was a tall, middle-aged man with a stern face that softened when he saw Jamal standing there. The flight had ended smoothly, but now it was time for a different kind of confrontation. Mr. Richardson, the captain greeted him, extending his hand. How can I help you? I need to address an incident that happened on board, Jamal said firmly, shaking his hand before continuing. One of your flight attendants, Clara, spilled hot coffee on me, and more than that, her attitude was dismissive, disrespectful, and racist. The captain's eyebrows furrowed in surprise. He hadn't expected such an accusation, but Jamal's tone and the intensity of the moment made it clear that this wasn't just a small complaint. Racism, the captain asked, clearly taken aback. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Richardson. We don't tolerate any form of discrimination on board. Can you tell me more about what happened? Jamal recounted the incident, his voice steady as he detailed how Clara had spilled coffee on him and then refused to offer an apology that seemed sincere. He explained the lack of empathy she had shown, and how her nonchalant response had only made the situation worse. The captain listened intently, his face hardening as the story unfolded. When Jamal was finished, he nodded slowly, his jaw clenched in frustration. I will personally look into this, Mr. Richardson, the captain said, his voice quieter but resolute. This is not the standard we hold ourselves to. You have my word, we will handle this immediately. I apologize for what you experienced. Thank you, Jamal said, his tone softening slightly, but his resolve remained firm. But this needs to be more than just a look into. This needs accountability. The captain nodded again. I understand. Rest assured we take these matters very seriously. Jamal turned to leave, his mind still racing with anger and frustration. He knew this wasn't just about a bad flight experience. This was about something much deeper, something ingrained in the very systems that govern society. He had experienced racism before, but this was blatant, and he couldn't let it slide. As he walked down the jet bridge to the terminal, he pulled out his phone, ready to make another call. He had to address this not just with the airline, but with his legal team. He wasn't going to let Clara's actions slip under the radar. This was about setting a precedent, making sure that people who mistreated others because of their race paid the price. The terminal was buzzing with people, but Jamal's mind was elsewhere. He was already thinking about the next steps, the call he needed to make, the actions that needed to be taken. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't, not after what had happened. As Jamal made his way through the terminal, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from his assistant, Laura. "The board meeting has been moved up to tomorrow afternoon. You need to be in New York tonight, right after the flight." Jamal read the message but felt a gnawing unease. He had bigger concerns now than just the business at hand. The incident on the plane was a stark reminder of how much work still needed to be done. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This wasn't something he could easily shake off. As he made his way to baggage claim, Jamal's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from one of the major news outlets. They had picked up the story about the incident on the plane. It was already making waves. His email inbox was filling up with messages from people commenting on the viral story. Everyone was talking about it, but not just about the coffee spill. They were talking about the racist treatment he had received, and how he would respond. For Jamal, the next few hours would set the stage for something much bigger than a simple customer service complaint. This was a pivotal moment, one where he could either remain silent or use his position to create lasting change. He knew which option he was choosing. As he picked up his luggage and headed for the exit, the determination in his heart grew stronger. This wasn't just about getting an apology. This was about making sure that the people who acted with hatred and prejudice were held accountable. This was about showing the world that the power dynamics had shifted, and he wasn't backing down. As Jamal stepped out of the airport and into the bustling streets of New York City, his mind was running a mile a minute. He was now on the verge of making a decision that would change the course of everything. It wasn't just about Clara, the racist flight attendant, or the momentary injustice he had suffered. It was about something much bigger. The pain he'd felt from the coffee spill had quickly turned into something more powerful, a relentless desire for justice. The incident had exposed not just the actions of a single person, but the deep-rooted racial prejudices that continued to affect the lives of people of color every day. Jamal wasn't the first to experience this, but he was determined to make sure he wasn't the last. After a brief taxi ride, Jamal arrived at his penthouse apartment. The city's neon lights illuminated the skyline, but the moment he stepped into his apartment, the weight of the situation hit him like a wave. He walked over to the bar, poured himself a drink, and sank into the couch. His phone rang. It was Laura, his assistant. "Jamal, I've just spoken with your legal team. They're ready to help you with the airline's response," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "But they're also suggesting you keep a low profile for now. This could blow up, and they want to control the narrative." Jamal took a long sip of his drink. Control the narrative. He had heard that line before. It was always about spin, about making sure the right things were said in front of the cameras. But this time, Jamal didn't care about spin. This was about truth. "I'm not interested in controlling the narrative, Laura," he said firmly. "I'm interested in making sure this doesn't happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone. This isn't a one-off. It's part of a bigger problem." Laura paused. "I understand, but just be careful. We don't want this to turn into a circus." As the night wore on, Jamal's thoughts returned to Clara, the flight attendant. He couldn't stop thinking about her attitude, the way she had dismissed him, the way she hadn't even tried to offer a real apology. It was as if her actions were justified, as if he was just another black man who didn't matter. But that wasn't the case. He wasn't going to let it slide. The next morning, Jamal woke up early. The hours of sleep had been interrupted by an overwhelming need to take action. He couldn't wait around for someone else to step in. He needed to make sure the airline knew exactly what they had done. The worst part was, he didn't know if Clara was the only one like that. Was she a lone agent, or was she just one piece of a bigger, more sinister system? Jamal arrived at the headquarters of the airline by mid-morning. The office was sleek, modern, and buzzing with activity. He didn't have an appointment, but he didn't need one. He was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the country, and he was there to demand answers. As he walked into the lobby, the receptionist immediately recognized him. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her tone friendly but slightly apprehensive. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with someone in charge," Jamal said coolly. Now, minutes later, Mark Davis, the airline's chief operating officer, walked out to meet him. Mark was a tall, middle-aged man, dressed in a suit, his expression shifting from polite to uneasy as he shook Jamal's hand. "Mr. Richardson," he said, his voice smooth, "what can I do for you today?" Jamal didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I want to talk about the flight I was on last night. I was treated unfairly by one of your flight attendants. and I want answers. Mark's face tightened, and he nodded slowly. I'm sorry to hear that. Let's sit down, and we can discuss this. They walked into a small conference room, and Jamal wasted no time recounting the entire incident, the spill, Clara's dismissiveness, the sheer arrogance she displayed. Mark listened carefully, taking notes as Jamal spoke. I don't think you understand the seriousness of this, Jamal said, his voice steady but growing more intense. This wasn't just an accident. This was a clear example of racism, a blatant display of disrespect toward me, and toward anyone who isn't white. I don't care if it was an accident. This isn't how your employees should treat customers. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Jamal continued before he could speak. I want a full investigation into this flight attendant's actions, and I want her removed from service. If she's still working for you after this, then I'll take legal action. I'll make sure the public knows exactly what happened. Mark sat back, his hands clasped in front of him. We take these kinds of allegations very seriously, Mr. Richardson. I'll make sure we handle this properly. But I also need to be honest with you. This could escalate quickly. I know, Jamal replied, his voice hard. And I don't care. I'm doing what's right. As Jamal walked out of the office, he felt a rush of determination. This wasn't just about holding Clara accountable. It was about changing the way people viewed incidents like these. He knew the backlash would be swift, but it didn't matter. His reputation was already under attack, and he wasn't going to let it stand. He had made his move, and now there was no turning back. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for every person who had ever been silenced by the system. The days following Jamal's meeting with the airline's COO were a blur. News of the incident quickly spread, and before he knew it, the story was everywhere. Media outlets were buzzing with reports about the black CEO and the racist incident on the flight. The hashtag Justice for Jamal began trending on social media. Some supported him, praising him for standing up, while others predictably tried to discredit him, claiming that it was just an accident. Jamal, however, didn't have time to waste on the trolls or the headlines. He was focused, and the fire that burned inside him wasn't going out anytime soon. Every morning as he walked through his office, he could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The situation with the airline was only one of many battles that black professionals like him faced every day. But this battle felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about shifting the culture, about making sure that incidents like this weren't swept under the rug, and about ensuring that people who faced racial prejudice had the power to speak out and demand justice. On the 5th day after the meeting, Jamal received a call from Mark Davis, the COO of the airline. His stomach tightened as he read the name on the screen. He knew the call was coming, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what Mark had to say. Richardson, I wanted to personally update you on the investigation. Mark's voice came through the phone, the tone more formal than it had been during their meeting. After reviewing the incident, we've made the decision to terminate Clara. We believe her actions were completely inappropriate and unprofessional. Jamal's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Clara's termination was a small victory, but it was one that would send a clear message to the airline and to the world that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Thank you, Jamal said, his voice steady. But that's not enough. This isn't just about one person. This is about the culture that exists in your company. You need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I agree, Mark replied, his tone softening. We're implementing new training programs and policies for all our staff members to ensure this type of incident never happens again. And I'm willing to work with you on this, Mr. Richardson. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Jamal could hear the sincerity in his voice, but he wasn't ready to forgive. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about making sure systemic racism was eradicated from every corner of society, especially in powerful organizations like the one Mark represented. After the call, Jamal spent the next few days working with his legal team to ensure that the incident was documented, the consequences were clear, and that the airline's response was publicly known. It was a delicate balance. He didn't want to be seen as out for revenge, but he also knew the significance of making sure that his actions set a precedent for anyone else who might face similar circumstances. While Jamal worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the public continued to follow the story. Justice for Jamal remained at the top of trending hashtags, and protests began popping up outside major airports, with people demanding accountability from airlines. The story had ignited something much bigger than a simple altercation. It had sparked a movement, but not everyone was supportive. On the 7th day after the incident, Jamal received a vicious email from a prominent member of the Business Leadership Council, a group of wealthy white executives. The email was short and dismissive, accusing him of playing the race card and damaging the reputation of an innocent company. Jamal's blood boiled as he read the words. He knew this was the kind of backlash he'd face. People in positions of power, people who didn't understand what it was like to face systemic racism every day. But it only fueled his determination to keep going. "This is why I'm doing it," he muttered to himself as he sat back in his chair. He wasn't going to let the voices of hatred and ignorance win. That evening, Jamal's assistant, Laura, walked into his office with a stack of papers. "Jamal, the media's asking for a statement from you. They want your side of the story, your perspective on the whole thing. They're making it sound like the airline's taking steps in the right direction, but they want your voice on it." Jamal paused, considering the options. He could remain silent, but that wouldn't change anything. He had the platform, he had the power to use his voice, his influence, to bring about the kind of change that was needed. He stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out over the city. The skyline stretched out before him, a symbol of his success, but also a reminder of the challenges ahead. This wasn't just about one racist incident. This was about a culture of inequality that permeated every level of society, and if he was going to use his platform, it had to be for more than just personal gain. "I'll make a statement," he said, his voice firm. "But it's not just about the coffee spill. It's about the need for accountability, for real change." Laura smiled, nodding. "I'll have the press release ready, Jamal. We'll get your message out there." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and emails as Jamal worked with his team to craft a statement that would encapsulate everything he stood for. The statement was direct, powerful, and unyielding. It didn't just talk about what happened on that flight, it addressed the larger issue of racial inequality and corporate responsibility. Once it was finalized, Jamal took a deep breath and hit send. The media reaction was swift. Articles, news segments, and interviews popped up all over the place. The airline's response was praised, but Jamal's statement took center stage. People from all walks of life were reaching out, sharing their stories, expressing their support. The story wasn't over yet, but Jamal knew that he had already made an impact. The fallout from Jamal's powerful statement was immediate and profound. The viral media coverage of his words was unlike anything he had experienced before. The public outcry was louder than ever, with social media campaigns, protest rallies, and discussions in every corner of the country. Justice for Jamal was no longer just a hashtag. It had become a movement, a call for accountability that transcended a single incident. Jamal was sitting in his office, reflecting on the past few days when his assistant Laura entered. She had a stack of papers in her hand and a grim expression on her face. "Jamal," Laura began, "the press has been relentless. We've received calls from every major network, and even some international outlets. But there's something else you need to see." She placed the papers on his desk and slid them toward him. It was a list of formal complaints and letters of support from countless individuals, other black professionals, airline passengers, and people across the nation who had witnessed the incident or had experienced similar discrimination. "They're all supporting you, Jamal," Laura said softly, "but there's something you need to read." She pointed to a letter at the top of the stack. It was from the airline's CEO, David Howell, and it wasn't just a typical corporate response. Jamal's brow furrowed as he read the letter aloud. "Dear Mr. Richardson, we have thoroughly reviewed the incident involving our flight attendant, Clara. We have determined that her actions were not only inappropriate, but also in direct violation of our company's ethics and anti-discrimination policies. As such, we have terminated her employment and have implemented new comprehensive training programs to address racial bias and discrimination within our staff. We also recognize that this is not enough. We are committed to providing you with a formal apology and offering compensation for the distress you experienced. Furthermore, we would like to meet with you personally to discuss how we can continue to ensure that our airline fosters an environment of inclusion and respect for all customers. We acknowledge that our company has a long way to go, and we are committed to doing the hard work necessary to rebuild trust with you and our community. Sincerely, David Howell." Jamal exhaled sharply, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. This was a step forward, but it wasn't enough. He wasn't looking for compensation or just an apology. He was looking for a true shift in the way things were done, in the way black customers were treated across the country. "David Howell might be sincere," Jamal said, glancing up at Laura, "but the problem isn't just with one flight attendant, it's a systematic issue. It's how corporate America treats people of color on a daily basis." Laura nodded. "We know, Jamal, but this is the first real step, and it's because of you, your statement, your courage, it's made them take notice." Later that week, Jamal was invited to appear on the Daily News Live for an exclusive interview. It was a prime opportunity to discuss not just the incident, but also his vision for real change. As he sat across from the anchor, Jamal felt the weight of the moment. His voice, calm but resolute, had been heard by millions, but this was the moment to push further, to address the deep-rooted issues that still plagued society. Anchor, Mr. Richardson, thank you for joining us today. Your statement and the subsequent actions you've taken have really resonated with so many people, but what comes next for you, for this issue? Jamal, I didn't expect this to turn into such a big story, but what it has done is show me that people are ready for change. I want to use my platform to push for better policies in the workplace. This is about creating a system that holds people accountable, not just for individual actions, but for the culture of racism and discrimination that exists across industries. We need systemic change. The interview ended, but the buzz around Jamal's words didn't. The company had taken action, but Jamal knew this battle was far from over. The airline was just the beginning. Corporate America, from the tech world to hospitality, needed to understand that Black voices, Black lives, mattered, and the story of what had happened on that plane was far from an isolated incident. Weeks went by, and Jamal's efforts continued to gain momentum. He began working with organizations that specialized in diversity and inclusion to ensure that the conversation didn't die down. Public support grew, and even large companies started to take notice. They began reaching out to him, asking how they could do better, how they could ensure that incidents like the one on the plane were prevented in their organizations. And as for Clara, the flight attendant, she had become a symbol of what happens when people act without empathy, when they act out of prejudice. The press followed her every move, and as expected, she was publicly fired. Her actions had ignited something much bigger, something she didn't see coming, and something that, for Jamal, was just the beginning of a larger mission. Months later, Jamal stood in front of a large crowd at a conference on racial equality in the workplace. He was no longer just the CEO of a successful tech company. He was a voice for change, for those who had been silenced for far too long. Change is hard, Jamal said to the audience, his voice steady but passionate. But it starts with us. It starts with speaking up, with demanding better, with not backing down when we know we're right. If I can do this, so can you. We all have the power to make a difference. The crowd erupted into applause, but for Jamal, the work had only just begun.